Hello? It's on. Hi, Tom. How are you? Um, so, I think you all know why you're here. Coffee and conversation on Thursday afternoon. We're welcoming back Seema Kenny. Did any of you come to her first presentation? It's been a little bit ago. Okay, great. So, Seema is an expert on genealogy, and the first presentation I think you did was the introduction to researching your genealogy. And so today she recommended a talk about census. So we're here to talk about the census. All right. Reminder, as always, that Walpole Media is here recording. And if you have a question, just raise your hand, and Seema will bring the microphone over or repeat the question. Okay. Thanks, Seema.
Thank you, Debbie. Let me just make sure that our last guests here have a handout. Okay, so census reports. Has anybody here ever been a census taker? Oh, good. Stories we can talk about. Census taker. We still have them even now, even in 2020. There were census takers. Probably not as many out in this way as there were in the cities, but there were still a few. So, as Debbie said, I am a professional genealogist. I live over in Upton, or up in, I don't know what direction I came. It was a nice ride, but whatever. I typically just do, for my services, I just do lecturing and writing. But I do have a wide network of other genealogists I know that if you get stuck on something, I'm happy to recommend people. Genealogy is one of those things where people develop specialties, usually based on their own family and what ethnicities they study. So you can't expect that just picking a genealogist off of a list or something is going to get you the right expertise for what you need. So just keep that in mind if you decide that you need some help with your research, as we all do. I just finished hiring somebody to translate 8 pages of Swedish for me because it was cheaper to hire her than to sit there and do it one word at a time with the dictionary for me and probably get it half wrong. It was the estate inventory from a third times great-grandfather from 1850. So it was interesting. I recognized 2 words when I started, cow and calf. I mean, K-O-W, what else could it be, right? So after that, I said, nope, somebody else can do this for me. But anyway, so we're here to talk about census records today. Census records are one of the easiest things to find. So we're going to talk about why it was created, when it was created, how it was created to an extent. We'll talk about some issues that we do have with census reports. You should be aware before you start reading them. They are not gospel. They are not set in stone. And I will give you some samples of census report research. Basically, what I'm going to do here is we're going to walk backwards through the census reports. So, why was the census created? So, it's a snapshot of what our country looks like every 10 years, right? Unfortunately, it is not geared for genealogy. We wish it was, but it's really not. It's geared so they know how many representatives each state gets in the House of Representatives, right? And then it's also used more locally to change your districts and redistrict the state and different things as well. And to determine how many voting precincts you have, because Upton just, with the 2020, we had to go to a 3rd voting precinct because we were right on the edge. We were just the maximum for having 2 precincts, and they decided, well, we'll do 3 while we have the time and energy to do it. So census dates, probably most of us are used to the census being done in April, but it wasn't always done in April. So you do want to be aware, and I know this is in your handout, you want to be aware that sometimes the census was done. Oh, wouldn't you love to get your hands on the guy who decided they should do it in January? Who the heck wants to walk around to their New England neighbors in January and knock on all the doors? The thinking was that they haven't planted the crops yet. More people will be home. Behind 10 feet of snow. How are you going to get to them? I don't get it, but whatever. So we do want to think about, there's some that they used to be done in August, they used to be done in June, there's that one from January. So don't make the assumption that everybody's going to age 10 years on the census. Okay? Sometimes they're only going to age 9, sometimes they're going to age 11 because it depends when the last one was taken. It also depends how truthful your ancestor or their neighbor was when they answered the question. The census questions are asked, and they're asked for you to answer as of the census date. Well, what happens if they don't get to you for another year? Is your memory good enough to know exactly who was where and how old everybody was a year ago? You know, when your birthday didn't matter and it wasn't important and it wasn't celebrated like they are today, people forgot when their birthday was. You know, my birthday is when the lilacs bloom. Or it's between, the forsythia and the irises, or, whatever. They were used to the crop cycles. They didn't necessarily know the calendars. So we need to think about those kind of things. So there are 3 different types of schedules. From 1790 to 1840, it was heads of household only, which means it's probably somewhere up around 90% men's names, right? Because that was life. Men were heads of household. Women didn't show up as much on these censuses. These are census reports that have little tick marks that tell you this is how many males of a certain age, how many females of a certain age, and possibly either how many free blacks or how many slaves of certain ages are in the household. But they'll only give you the name of the head of household. And then from 1850 to 1930, yay, they got smart, they decided they're going to list every person in the household. Now, not every one of these tells you the relationship of the people, so you do have to perhaps go find the directions for the census. They're all online. And read the directions. It doesn't guarantee that the person who filled it out followed the directions, but at least if the directions say the wife should be listed second, the one that's typical is the husband, the wife, any children that belong to that couple, followed by any other children from either other households or other marriages, and then followed by boarders and anybody who happens to live at the house. So when you write up your genealogy, your family history, you could at least say, based on the census instructions and the placement of names, I can assume that, or I am assuming that this is the relationship, unless you find some other document to prove that they were married or whatever. And then from 1940 to 2020, we actually get the bonus of knowing who the informant is. So that's a big plus, although my husband will tell you that in, 2012, when the 1940 census came out, everyone I looked at, all I did was say, oh, this one lied about that, this one lied about that. He's like, why are you looking for it if everybody's lying? I said, because it's fun to know who lied and what they lied about. I'm sorry, but it tells you something. If, I had a friend, I found his parents' census report for 1940. His, actually, it was his grandparents, and his parents had recently married. Well, one of the questions on the 1940 census is, where did you live in 1935? Well, I figure when the mother-in-law says that the new daughter-in-law lived at the same house, she must have liked her, right? If she didn't like her, she would have made a big stink about saying, oh, no, she didn't live here then. I know she didn't live there because there was no way she was living with her boyfriend and his parents 5 years before they got married, Good Catholics don't do that kind of thing in 1940. But it's interesting, and you can draw some conclusions from some of those things as well. So we do want to take a note. People did move around. That means sometimes they didn't get counted at all. Other times it means they got counted twice. All right? And just look at where it was and the dates when it was taken. You can maybe figure out How come they were counted twice? Geographic borders change. So whenever you're doing genealogical research, one of the best things to do is make sure you know, well, where are the town borders? Where are the state borders, the county borders? As those change over time, maybe not so much in our lifetime, but certainly prior to our births, you want to make sure that you're looking for the documents in the right place. Of course, people could change their names, not necessarily legally, but, we all know people that go by a nickname their whole life, and it's not till you read their obituary that you figure out what their legal name was, right? Or you've only ever been introduced to them by a nickname, so you don't realize that Bobby's not their name and that Robert is nowhere in their name, but it was something that came up from childhood or whatever. When you're not carrying around a picture that has your name on it, like your license or something, it's very easy for you to tell somebody, oh, my name is, and they have no way to second guess or judge that that's not your name. The census taker went around house to house. Now, it's nice to look at the pictures, and they sit there with their big book, and they're sitting on the couch, and they're taking down information. They did not sit in every single person's living room, right? I mean, they caught people out on the farm, they caught people in the garden, wherever they could get them, because every name they recorded was worth a few pennies. These were not, dumb people. They were going to get as much money as they could, right? Then they would go home, and they had to make copies. No, let's rephrase that. There had to be copies made, not necessarily by the census taker, sometimes by his wife or children. So, mistakes happen, right? You try to read Dad's handwriting and you think, oh, that's an A. No, it's really an O. It's an I or an E, whatever. Be prepared. Spelling does not count in genealogy, no matter what you're looking at, right? And there could be abbreviations. There could be nicknames, right? The space is small. William gets written as WM. Charles is CHAS. Some of them are very obvious abbreviations. Others are not so obvious, so we have to give them a little thought. And, of course, the big one to keep track of, there was no rule that the family all had to be on the same page for most of the censuses. So if you get to the bottom of the page and you think somebody's missing, go to the top of the next page, because you might find the rest of the children. And they may even be children that you didn't know existed, or friends or cousins or whatever that were living with them. So the census is going to give us lots of clues. And let's remember they're just clues. Because if the neighbor answered, I don't know about you, but my neighbor doesn't have a clue where I was born, or where my husband was born, or probably not even when I was born. But it is going to give you clues about where did they live. Were they married? A couple of the censuses ask for the women, how many children did you give birth to and how many are still living? Oh boy, is that a big clue whether you've got all the right names or not in your family tree. They may give you some information about occupation. I call it health status, but on the census it'll say, are they deaf, dumb, blind, insane? There's all kinds of little things. And you need to look up those definitions. Look up how that term was defined at the time of that census. Because insane did not always mean what we think it means today. We want to make sure we put this in the right context. Definitely information about their education, where they were born, whether or not they've been naturalized. And it could just be something that says PA, which means they've put in their papers. They intend to get naturalized. It doesn't mean they're ever going to finish it, but they're intending to, because they've at least filed one document with the court. Do they own a home? Do they, in some cases it will ask the value of that home. Yeah, right. Somebody asked you the value of your house. Do you have any idea what it is? I mean, I have an idea what I paid for it. I have an idea what I could put it on the market for, but I don't know that either of those is the right value. But you can use that to kind of learn about the neighborhood where your ancestor lived. Look at the neighbors on the same page. How valuable was their house? Look on the page before, the page after. See how their houses go. The only one I feel comfortable with, my grandfather was a contractor, so if he answered, I feel pretty good that he knew the value of his house. And then there are some that will ask us about military service. So let's take a look at some census reports. This is just the top. It happens to be the 1881 because it was a nice clear picture to use. The top of the census is always going to give you information about the state, the county, and the city that the person is in. It may also, if it's old enough, tell you where their post office was. And that's what can be kind of interesting to look up on the map, because where they lived and where the post office was is not always the same town, right? And it'll give you an idea that, oh, these people were in the rural and they had to drive to get their mail and probably all their supplies as well. If you're in a big enough city looking at something, it'll give you an enumeration district, right? Each census taker is assigned a district. It's supposed to be an area that they can cover in a matter of a week or less. So especially in the city, they get, on a map, it looks like a small area, but of course in the city, the buildings go up higher, so it's not quite as tiny as we might believe. And most important, over at the right-hand side at the top is the enumeration date. When was the page filled out? Not the April 1st or January 1st date of the actual census, but the actual date that the page was filled out. And that's important to look at when you are trying to decide, like, do I have the right family? Because I think this child should be a little older or a little younger. Look up at that date and figure out, oh, he just had his birthday. Mom gave the current age, not the age he was 2 months ago. It happens. And you'll find, people that were born after April 1st will be on a census because by the time they were asked, well, of course she lives here, so of course I have to put the baby on, Technically, no, you don't, because she didn't live on April 1st. And conversely, you'll get people who died before or after April 1st who, before April 1st that will show up if they waited too long to ask questions. Again, time wasn't for some of these ancestors what it is for us. So let's start going backwards, and I'm going to show you a bunch of census reports for my family, because I don't have to ask anybody's permission to show these names, because they're mine. I'm okay with it. So the 1950 census was just released to the public on April 1st of 2022. It is the first time that the archives have released a census, and it already had a partial index. Usually when they release it at midnight plus 01 or whatever you call that in the morning, they just release tons and tons of pieces of paper. I mean, they're digitized, but they're just pieces of paper, and there's no way to really, not an easy way, to go find your ancestor until somebody looks at all those pieces of paper and makes an index. This time the thing was huge, and they actually provided an index, which was wonderful. Full indexes on Ancestry, Family Search, they're still being worked on. They will be worked on for another 2 or 3 months before they're done. Some states are finished, others are nowhere near finished. So this is the 1950. This is my father's family. And they happen to be at the very bottom of the page, which made my example very nice, because what happened here is my grandfather, who's at the top of that blue arrow, he was on one of the special lines on the page. If you're on a special line for some of these censuses, you get asked these extra questions at the bottom. So the top blue arrow is pointing at the 5 people in the family, which was a shock. I only expected to find 4 there. My father's actually on the 1950 census twice in 2 different towns. And then the blue arrow at the bottom are the extra questions that my grandfather was asked to answer. So you do want to look, make sure you understand the form. I think it's 4 or 5 of these anyway, going backwards, that are going to have these. If you're on this line, you get extra questions at the bottom. Don't ignore those, because they can be very valuable pieces of information, especially if you're just getting started. So here's the 1940. And again, I'm going to show you the full page, and then the next slide has a blow up so we can concentrate on different parts of it, but just so you get a feel of what it looks like. On this one, This is the little mark that tells me these are people who got asked these extra questions at the bottom. Only 2 people per page. Ooh, that's not enough. I like it better when they ask everybody the special questions. So if we look at so let me go to the blow up because it'll be easier. So here's the top. Again, my family happened to be at the top of the page, so I get all the headings as well. The yellow circles are showing you the little mark. There's an X inside of a circle. That's who answered the question. So I know that Grandma answered for her household and my great-grandmother answered for her household. Great-grandma didn't even speak English, so no wonder she lied about some of these things. She certainly didn't understand the question. So I have information here. Oh, come on, I know there's, there it is, little purple one way over there. My great-grandmother answered over here in the purple. They're both aliens. Well, maybe. On the 1930 census, they were both naturalized, so who knows? Like I said, she didn't speak English, so I don't know if she understood the questions. The extra questions, which I split this would normally be, a big sheet from left to right. So the piece on the bottom there, it's only for people over 14. My father didn't have to answer these questions or have questions answered about him because he was under 14. So when you look at this area down here that's blank, well, that's my father and his younger brother. They were under 14. They weren't being asked, what do you do for work? Whatever. So again, it's take in what's on the page, take in the directions. So 1930 looks pretty similar. However, on this one, we don't have any special lines. They've asked everybody the same questions. Yay. Now we get to find out more about people's parents and heredity and things on the census. So let's take a look. Again, my own family. There's Grandma at the top of the page. So her neighbor, listed underneath them, next to her neighbor's name, you see these numbers, 8585. There's no number next to Grandma. That's a clue. Every head of household has numbers next to them. So if Grandma's at the top of the page with no number, where do I find Grandpa? At the bottom of the previous page. So here's Grandpa. He's on page 1B. Grandma's on page 2A, whatever it is. Here's the number up there for Grandpa. The 2 numbers represent what's the sequence of houses I've gone to. So when we had that blow up, the neighbor was 8585. So this is the 85th house that this enumerator has gone to. The second number indicates the family. So if the numbers are the same, that means he's gone to 85 one-family houses, single-family houses, right? If you're in a city, you're much more likely to find things where, oh yeah, this is building 85, but it's family 183. Well, he had some apartment buildings in there, whatever, because each building gets a number and then each family gets another number. So here's another blow up of the 1930. And just to show that this one does have those columns for your data about your home. How much, whether or not you rent or own, right? So an R or an O. Certainly if it's an O, that's a clue. You're going to go look for more information. Then the real estate value. And by looking at all of these, you can kind of get a picture of the neighborhood. Who's got the biggest, most valuable house? Who's got the smallest house? If they're all exactly the same, you might even think, oh, this is maybe factory houses where some factory built all the houses. They all look exactly alike. If you find that somebody's marked as being the owner of a house, well, that's a big clue. Now you got to go find the deeds. When did they buy the house? How much did they pay for the house? When did they sell the house? Who'd they sell it to? For how much money? Where'd they get the money? Did they pay off the loan for the money? All of that is in the deed records. And it can give you another story of what was going on financially with those ancestors, assuming they owned the house. Of course, the dollar amounts, we all know how that goes. Most of us in this room probably remember when gas was less than $1 a gallon, Like, we can't really look at the numbers and comprehend some of what they paid. I mean, I've seen census where people say, oh yeah, I pay $20 a month rent. It's like, I pay 20 more than that for my guests for a week, never mind, for a whole month. So use the numbers to compare against others, not to compare against today. So another one that's on the 1930 is, there is the column there that says, did you have any military service? This group didn't happen to have any. My grandfather never served in World War I because he was busy building ships. And that was deemed a war necessity trade, so he didn't have to serve in the military. But if it had said yes, and it does even ask for a little indication of what war you were in, there's a whole nother set of records for you to try and go find. We can find draft cards for just about everybody because, just about every teenage boy had to go fill out a draft card, right? That doesn't mean they actually served. But if they're marked down as having served, oh, well, now we might find muster rolls, we may find pension records, we might find a unit history, all kinds of other things that will fill us in on, well, what were they doing during that time that they served? And I have another talk I do that has a lot to do with Fort Devens. And I gave it a few months ago, and one of the guys that was in the audience happens to be on the board of trustees there. He told me after my talk, he said, yeah, well, only 10% of the people that are in the military actually go into combat. The rest are there to support. So don't be surprised if you find out that, oh yeah, they were, sending troops, or they were doing paperwork kind of stuff. That's okay too. Those are important people. My uncle was tracking battle casualties, so he was extra important because we want to know who died where when. So 1920 looks fairly similar. Again, everybody's going to be asked the same question. But there's some columns in here that give you an idea of where people are born. And not just the person listed, but it'll tell you where was their father born and where was their mother born. Now, this is actually following my grandmother's line. So she was born in Maine. And when I look at this, I go, well, there's a lot of people born in Maine here. This is probably when she was a teenager. So that kind of can clue me in to say, okay, these are probably long-term residents. Maybe I can look at some of them and get some hints about other things my ancestors might have done, how they would have interacted with their neighbors. I've seen other ones where, everybody on the page was either born in Ireland or their their parents were born in Ireland. That might give you a hint that they had some pretty traditional Irish kind of things going on in the neighborhood or whatever. Again, it's to get you thinking about, well, what else was going on? Like, it's nice to know where they lived, and yes, they were this old and this year, but we can figure that out from birth dates, right? We don't need a census to tell us how old they are. We need a census to give us clues on other informative things. So 1910, again, everybody's asked the same questions. You can see there's some consistency in here. They're trying to be good about this. And don't forget, this is 1910. Yes, well, they're just starting to use computers to tabulate a lot of this data. But here's a close-up of the left-hand side of this page. You can't see it too well because they wrote kind of light, but the census taker actually wrote the name of the street. Like, well, now I can find a map and I can go find where the street is, right? They're on Chicopee Road. I happen to know where this is because I've visited this place quite a few times. But it's nice to know that, okay, they put in the name of the road. This little vertical bar here, that's to say that everybody after that, well, it's vertical because I switched it. It would be horizontal if I was looking at the page properly. That's to say that that's the end of Chicopee Road. The people under that live on a different road. So we like when the enumerators follow the directions. So 1900, again, we've got everybody with the same questions. It's a little smaller. This one, you can almost read it if you printed 8.5 by 11, but it's a little tight. The older ones you can definitely fit on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. So here we've got some questions about the type of land they live on. Is it a farm or not? Um, if it was a farm, this last column, very rightmost column on the page, is giving us a number for the farm schedule. Now, not every farm schedule still exists, unfortunately, because nobody thought that 100 years later we were going to want to know this information. Silly people. Of course we want to know. But if you have an ancestor who has a farm schedule listed, it is worth looking to see if you can find the farm schedule. The number here tells you what line on the farm schedule has your family. So for instance, the one right there where the arrow is pointing, the farm schedule number says 27. So if I find the farm schedule for the same time frame, I'm going to look at this town, I'm going to look at line 27, and I am going to learn so much about these ancestors. Let me show you what a farm schedule looks like. This is a blank form that I printed off of a website somewhere for the 1880. I know we haven't quite got back that far, but it's one of the ones they had a form for. It asks not only for the farmer's name, which should be the same name that's on the census, but it asks about the land they have. How much of it is forest? How much of it is meadows? How much of it is pastures? It asks how many horses, calves, cows, ponies, sheep, chickens, pigs. What do they have? What kind of crops do they have? Is it a dairy place? What do they do with their milk, their eggs, their ice cream? How much of it do they use versus how much of it do they sell? You can learn an awful lot from this information if you can find it. I have found a couple for my family in Massachusetts. I can't remember what year it was, but oh my gosh, just a wealth of information if you can find them. Unfortunately, it was one of those things they didn't think anybody would be interested in. Silly people. So, 1890. Okay. Don't go looking unless you really think you're going to find it. 1890 census was burnt in Washington, D.C. Back when the buildings were made of wood, and, you know, there were those people who attacked Washington, D.C. because they didn't like our government and things like that. Yeah, I know. We watched one of the hearings last night. So most of the New England states are gone. But these states here, Alabama, Georgia, Illinois, Minnesota, New Jersey, there are parts of the 1890 that exist. But I want you to remember that, you know, as you're working back and you get to 1900, you can make an assumption that people didn't move for 20 years and use the same town. See if you find your ancestors in the 1880. It's a big gap. There are lots of other ways to learn and records to use to kind of fill in that gap. But I don't want you looking for something that doesn't exist. And that's true not just for the census, but for all records. You know, you always should double check before you go looking for the records. And God knows why I happened to look this one up, but a birth record. Let's say, you know, oh yeah, I want great grandma's birth record. Well, where did she live? Whatever state she lived in, before you go looking, go to the Secretary of State's website for that state. Find out when they required birth registrations, because we are so spoiled in Massachusetts. I happened to look up one day, I don't know why I picked on them, but the state of Kansas. They didn't require birth registrations until 1906. Sorry, but great-grandma was here for a long time before 1906. So if she was in Kansas, I'm up a creek. Why am I going to go looking for a birth record that doesn't exist? That's a waste of time, and I got plenty of things to do with my time, so I can't be wasting my time looking for something that doesn't exist. Give me a needle in a haystack, I will spend hours looking for it, right? But I don't want to look through the haystack if there's no needles in it. So keep in mind that the 1890 falls in that category. It's not likely you're going to find an 1890 census. God bless you if you do, because it's the only one where they did one family per page. It has some great information on it, but unfortunately, wooden buildings, candles, they don't always agree. And water to put out the fire does not agree with paper either. So whether the fire got rid of it or the water damaged it, it doesn't really matter. It's gone. So we end up jumping back to 1880. Now in 1880, this is great. It fits on a 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper without a problem. There's just not a lot of data on it. They just didn't ask too many questions. But then again, the country was young. The legislature didn't necessarily know what was going to happen with this. So on this one, I kind of blew up and copied the column here for occupation. And I also wrote it in the little arrow box here. So the occupations on here: farmer, keeping house, keeps the stable, he's a laborer, at school, school teacher, stone cutter. Kind of gives me an idea that this part of town was a lot of manual labor, a lot of people working with their hands, which makes sense in 1880. What else were they going to be doing? Maybe tells me that everybody had some common goals, some common gripes about things. Probably a fairly unified neighborhood, if you can call it a neighborhood. But when I get that information, what am I going to go do? Was there an association? Was there a club for this occupation? Did they have to get a license to practice this? Are there history books, or are there stories about what people in this occupation did, how they got trained, how they worked, what they did? If it's in New England, one of the things I'm going to look at, depending on what trade they're in, I want to look at the town reports. Did they ever do work for the town? If you've got a tradesperson, they probably made a fence. They may have, put in some stone walls. If they're a mason, they may have made barrels, all kinds of different things that would be in the town reports because the town would have paid them. So somewhere in that town report, it's going to indicate who they paid, and maybe at a historical society, you'll find even a lot more information about what they did for the town and things. So these are all different clues. Again, look at that occupation and decide, well, okay, what was that? First of all, if you don't recognize the name of it, you have to go look it up in a dictionary and say, what was this in 1880? Black's Law Dictionary is good for that. But then, research that occupation and see what you can find. So 1870, you can see we're getting a little bit less and less information on these. So many fewer questions here. But let's look at another column in here. We've got the column for, a couple of columns, but we've got the ones here for education. When did you go to school? Did you go to school in the last year? Again, town reports. I have some distant cousins. I only went looking for them because actually it was about this same time. They lived in the town next to the one I live in now. They lived in Mendon, Mass. They all born and died in Maine, but for 20 years or something, they lived in Mendon, Mass. So I went over to Mendon and I said, well, let me see what I can find out about them. 3 children. They're in the school board reports for 3 or 4 years in a row because they had perfect attendance at school. And that was a big issue at the time. The kids weren't going to school. Why weren't they going to school? Mom and Dad needed them on the farm. My cousins grew up the children of shoemakers who went to a little shoemaker factory kind of thing and made shoes all day. They didn't need their kids at home, so they were in the town reports. They were ages from anywhere from 6 to 12 in these town reports. Now, I don't typically look up for records for kids that age, but I do now because I found some. Right? And it's kind of nice to know that, okay, their parents were concerned and they sent them to school. Are they deaf, dumb, blind, insane, or idiotic? Well, I'd want to know who answered that question, right? But again, check out those terms. What did they mean in 1880? They didn't necessarily mean the same thing that we immediately decide that they shouldn't mean today. But this is the kind of information, no matter which census you're at. I'm only using a census to give you an example. A lot of these things are on every census, so I just want to show you ones where I can use them for examples. So 1860, now we're really getting down to having very little. And then 1850, the first one that has everybody listed on it. And there's a little bonus on this particular page. If I turn it sideways here, he was nice enough to indicate that the people on this page were living in a boarding house. Well, there's no need to figure out if they're related to each other because they're in a boarding house. I mean, chances that, you know, yes, there's a couple people with the same name, but I don't have to spend much time trying to figure out how many of my ancestors were on this page. And if we go down a little further on the page, there we go. All right, see that purple outline there? Here's another example of what I was talking about with the house and the family numbers. So house number 25 has family number 31 and family number 32. I don't know, is it a duplex? I haven't gone to look. One side of it there, family 31, is pretty darn large. So if it's a duplex, I'd rather be with family 32 because you get a little more room for your elbows at the table and whatever. But notice that family or house 26 is way down towards the bottom there. So again, just a sample of how those numbers can give you some idea of what else is going on. Okay, so we've gone through all the censuses going backwards that have everybody listed. Now we're into heads of household. So, and I will show you some examples of these, but this is the kind of chart that you can find available at several places on the internet. I happen to make this one up in Excel. But if we start with, as we're going backwards here, the 1840 census, they were asking for males that are 0 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, 5 to 19, 20, 29, 30, 39. Age groups. And all you're going to see are little tick marks or numbers in there. Usually tick marks. You know, the little ones you make like 4 and cross the 5th one with a diagonal line or whatever. But in 1830, the age brackets were a little different. Instead of 10 to, no. Where are they? Where's the one that I can't see from this angle? Maybe they were slightly the same. Certainly by 1820, they get a little different. Now we've got 0 to 9, 10 to 15, 16 to 18. Yep, of course, they want to know how many boys are around that might serve in the military, right? When they first started in 1790, didn't care what age the girls were. Just tell us how many girls are in the house, because the girls weren't going to be helpful in the military, right? But the boys, yep, I want to know if they're under 15 or over 15. So it's a little harder to track people in this area because the age brackets are not the same every year. So you do have to do a little more math. You have to do a little more deductive reasoning to figure out if you've got the right families. On top of that, you have to be able to read the freaking things. So here's some samples of what I have for my family. So here's an 1840. The top one in the red there is Abraham Anderson. And I might be able to figure out what those tick marks are. This one's actually pretty straight. But I have to see all the headings at the top, and, you know, it's not the prettiest thing. This is before the government actually supplied forms. Everybody used their own pieces of paper, and they knew what columns they needed, but they were allowed to make up the columns and draw them on the page however they wanted. Yeah, that's great for a country, right? Nice uniform pieces of paper. Well, here's 1830. Abraham's up at the top of the page. Yeah, you know why he's at the top of the page? Because they wrote them in alphabetical order. No telling who's a neighbor of who on this one. They put them all in alphabetical order. There were actually people who filled out all the names before they even went and asked the questions, because that way they could have them all in alphabetical order, because they knew everybody in the town. I mean, we're getting back to when towns were pretty small, and everybody was related to everybody, so of course you knew who lived there, right? 1820, I'm not even sure I got the right people circled here. The line's a little bit crooked. I need some rulers and some other things here if I'm going to work with this piece of paper. But I was able to find his name. 1810 gets a little bit trickier. I don't even have column headings. Okay. There's 2, 1, 3, 1, 2, 1, but I don't know what they are. Right? So I've got to do some extra research. I've got to look for places that are going to tell me, well, what were the columns that they were trying to fill out and what order did they go in? And then we have, oh yeah, okay, that one's pretty nice and neat, actually. I can almost read that one. Dear Benjamin. And then we have the very first one. Oh, they didn't have a clue what they were doing. All right, they've got a list here, and it gives you the head of household and a couple of numbers. I think it's 4 columns of numbers. But there's 4 sets of people going across the page. All right, so every time you start to see, more writing here, right, here's one set of people, and there's a second, third, fourth set of people, each with 4 columns after it. This is pretty common because the census taker could make up their own page and do it however they wanted. I'm just trying to show you that, obviously it gets harder and harder, but so does anything as we go backwards in time because things were not quite as nice and neat, right? We'd love it if they were all typed, but they couldn't type them before typewriters existed and things like that, right? So you can get pre-printed forms on the internet. You can look on Ancestry, Family Search, Family Search Wiki. There are plenty of websites that will allow you to print off as many of these forms as you want. And a lot of times that's how people start their research. They print off these forms, they find the census, and they copy it. Just remember that every letter you copy has the risk of being a mistake, right? You might write it the way you think it's supposed to be, but that doesn't mean that's how they wrote it. But you can find these very readily. And even if you just keep them as a reference, it's handy to have it so that you can look up and figure out what column headings are and things, because these are a little more legible than the big sheets squished down to your computer screen. So here's another one from the National Archives. They all have them. They do them slightly differently, but they're pretty much all the same information. So where are you going to find these? Well, Ancestry, Find My Past, FamilySearch.org. If you haven't used FamilySearch.org for your research, I encourage you to start because it's free. My favorite 4-letter F word. The other 2, Ancestry, Find My Past, are subscription sites, so unless you're using them at a library or something, you have to pay for that. Genealogy Library, Heritage Quest, which you can use through a library. You can use it at home, you just have to use it because your library offers it. Historical societies, genealogy societies, or libraries and state archives all have copies of these things, and most of them, the early censuses were actually distributed in bound books. They're very skinny, but you can go to a library and you can find them on the shelf, and it will say, 1790 census for Massachusetts, and it'll have the entire state. Mind you, that wasn't very much in 1790, but it'll have everybody that was there. It's sometimes kind of cool if you're doing colonial research to go and say, okay, well, who's on the census and how many of these people am I related to? Because if you're related to people long enough ago, you're related to almost the whole town. And then you end up doing a lot more research about that town. So let's look at how this works. I haven't done my 1950 research yet, but my great-grandfather was born in 1879. Oh, thank the Lord. He made the 1880 census, just barely. Because otherwise I wouldn't have seen him until 1900. I knew him. He was one of my favorite babysitters when I was little. So I wanted to write about his life. Well, I want to write about it. One of these days I'll get around to this line. I went and found all his census reports, right? So again, notice 1890 is missing, and I don't expect you to be able to read these, but I found all the ones 1880 to 1940. I did finally find his 1950. His name was written wrong. How do you screw up Ellis? You put a line through the L's and then the person thinks they're T's. I'm like, honestly, people, no mistakes on the census. Stop putting little extra lines. So then I took notes from each census report, and I wrote down the date it was taken, right? So you can see I've got dates all over the map here of when the census was actually taken. I wrote down the address or the city, town, county, whatever that the thing was in. I wrote some information about him. Who was on the census with him? Children, grandchildren, mother, his wife, whatever. And whatever else I could gather from the census. Looking at every single column, I just made notes. After I had all the notes, because that was a task in itself, then I was able to start writing. All right, so great-grandpa John William. He was always called John William. Oh, that reminds me, I have to tell my son just had a baby. They named him William. I'll have to remind him that his great-great-grandfather had that as a middle name, too. So I was able to write that he's born in Connecticut, February 1879. Census didn't give me a date, but it gave me the month and the year, right? I knew his parents because he's on the census as a baby. I know that somewhere around 1901, he married Rebecca. He married Meta. I know her second name is Rebecca, but that's because I have other documents. I didn't get it from the census. She was born in New York in 1881. And then I can write a little bit. Basically, what I did here was a sentence or two about each census report. Less when he was a baby, because what are you going to write? You know, he lived with his brothers and sisters and his mother and father, whatever. And then I was able to finish up from 1940, list out all his children. And because I had some information, not much, but I had a little bit of information, I went ahead and used those same census notes to write something about his parents, Charles and Sarah. What do I do next? Oh, goodness. Now I get to sit in the sun and I get to make a big, long list. All the things that I didn't learn from the census. What day were they born? What was Meta's maiden name? Where was Meta born in New York? When was she born in New York? All kinds of different questions that I can come up with. And now I have a research plan of what else am I going to do? How else am I going to learn more things about this family? Because for every one of these questions, the next thing to do is to say, okay, how am I going to find the exact place and date of John Williams' birth? Well, it wasn't all that hard, but it was hard because it wasn't recorded. His parents had only arrived here about a year before he was born. They never recorded his birth. His birth was recorded, just like my other grandfather, when he was 65 and wanted Social Security. He actually recorded his own birth with a couple of witnesses who were willing to swear that, yes, this is him, and I agree that he was born, and, you know. So that's nice because I got a lot more information than I would have gotten on an 1879 birth record from a town, but it's kind of frustrating, too, because the first thing I went and looked for was the town record, and it wasn't there. But I can sit there, and this is how you do your research, is you come up with this question, what is it I want to learn? And then you say, okay, what documents are going to tell me what the answer is, and where am I going to find those documents? So you need to build that knowledge of, okay, I know where to find the information, and let's face it, we've filled out enough forms in our life where we've written down our birth date and our birthplace that we could say just about any form they ever filled out, if it still existed, was going to have that information. But where am I going to find them? You know, and what kind of record am I looking for? Am I looking for a birth record? Am I looking for a church record? Is it maybe going to be in their obituary, right? Maybe a hint, you never know. So every one of these questions that I couldn't answer from the census, I can now go find some information somewhere else, hopefully. Because the census does just give us clues, and we need to look in a lot of other records to confirm those clues. You know, those great-grandparents that, I don't know, did they put in papers? Did they get naturalized? Or did they remain aliens? I mean, I've got a census report that tells me all three. I don't trust any of them, and I may never find the records, and that's okay too. So think about what you learned, what you didn't learn, right? It's like doing the grocery list. You open the cabinet and you try to say, okay, what's missing? You know, what's missing from this information? You won't know what's missing until you write a little paragraph. And then go through and figure out, well, where else am I going to find information? What's not included about my ancestors that I want to know? And I put the website here, and I'm pretty sure it's in the handout as well, for the IPUMS. I forget what it stands for, but it's some big statistics organization, whatever. They have a lot of statistics from the census, and they also have all the enumerator instructions from every single census, right up to 2020. So you can look up and find out, you know, what they were supposed to do in this column or that column. Anybody here have Eastern European ancestry that you know about? Not the easiest one to do, but I will mention since they are filming. There is one census, and I can't remember which year it is, but there's one census where the enumerators were actually told, if somebody tells you they're born in this country, write down that country. And it all has to do with the turmoil in Eastern Europe of, you know, which countries existed at what point and how they were changing and things because of the two world wars. So don't necessarily think that somebody lied, because it could have been that they were told to lie because of the enumerator, or the enumerator was told to lie and put down the wrong information, which boggles my brain. But I guess I can understand it when you start looking at all the countries and how short some of them existed and whatever. So I'm happy to try to take a couple of questions. I will try to bring the mic around, or at least repeat your question if it's short enough, if there are any. Questions? I wish you the best of luck on your research. My name and email and information is on the handout. I have one attendee back here. I have to bring her a handout. So feel free to contact me with questions if you would like. I'm happy to answer emails. I check my 8 email accounts 3 or 4 times a day. I know, that's crazy, isn't it? So feel free to send me questions if you need to, and I'd be happy to help you out with what I can. Whether that's me or recommending somebody else who has a bit more of an expertise in the area you need, that's fine. So thank you very much. Enjoy your coffee and cookies.